When I say I couldn't put it down, I had this thing glued to my face. Hello, I'm Sloan, and this year I read 17 books, ranging from thrillers, biographies, true crime, nonfiction, science fiction, fantasy, horror, and just good old fiction. So even though 17 books in the world of BookTube is basically nothing, like there are people on YouTube that have read way more than that, I still thought it'd be fun to walk you all through all of the books I read, ranking them from the worst of the worst to the best of the best, talking about what they're about. I won't give any spoilers though, and what I liked and what I didn't. So let's get started. The worst book that I read in 2024 was one that I read in January. So it's been a year now, and it was Lessons in Chemistry by Bonnie Garmus. And I think this is a hot take. I know a lot of people love this book. I hated it. It's one of the worst books I've read in a long time. It is about a chemist named Elizabeth Zott, and it's set in the 1960s. And she is a chemist, a scientist, but ends up with a cooking show where she is not only cooking and using a bunch of scientific words like sodium chloride, she is also teaching the world about women's equality, which love women's equality. I am a woman in STEM myself, but it was just screaming social justice topics. And I really prefer those things to be subtle and to kind of leave you to come to your own conclusion versus screaming at you. And especially in 2024, I feel like we know that. And if I want to read about women's equality in the 60s, I like nonfiction. I'm just going to read a nonfiction book. And if I'm going to read fiction, I want it to be able to share something that a nonfiction book can't tell me. And this one just didn't. It was also actually a bit of a fantasy. I'm not going to give too much away, but there were some fantastical elements that I definitely wasn't expecting. And I didn't really like they were fine. The worst part to me about this book, though, was the science part and her being a scientist. It was just so grating to me. It really felt like she was just a caricature of what the author thought a scientist would be like and what she thought a scientist would do. But I'm a data scientist, so I'm not like a chemist or something like that. But the people that I'm around don't just randomly say scientific words in normal conversation. That's super not normal to call salt sodium chloride for fun. And it just really, really took me out of it and just super wasn't believable to me in any way. I also really found a lot of the characters to be super one-dimensional. Bonnie's only personality trait is that she's a scientist, and it just doesn't make me care about her. I took a lot of notes on this book in a journal that I now can't find anywhere because I moved 1,000 miles. So forgive me if anything is fuzzy, but I also remember the book starts out by sharing the ending first and then kind of works its way back to the beginning, and then you have to follow along and wait to see how it happens. And because I just super didn't care about any of the characters, I was also like, I already know what happens at the end, so I don't really care about any of this. And that didn't help either. I actually read this book because my mom watched the show and loved it. And so I've heard the show is great. I probably will watch the show at some point, but this is the worst book I've read in a long time. The next worst book that I read in 2024 that also got 1 out of 5 stars was Wave by Sonali Darinayagala. And I have my notes here, which is what I'm looking at. I didn't want to pronounce her name incorrectly. Solid chance I did. I am sorry if I did. I'm doing my best here. This is a memoir that I listened to on audiobook, I think for free through Spotify. And it's about her experience getting hit with the devastating, horrific tsunami that hit the coast of Sri Lanka in 2004. And it ended up killing almost everyone in her family. I don't know if I'm sorry if that's a spoiler. It's nonfiction, and I feel a little bad giving a memoir 1 out of 5 stars. This is somebody's life, but it was the most depressing memoir I've ever read. It is completely all about her sadness and devastation and her trying to cope with it, with a few happy memories of her family post tsunami sprinkled in. And those feelings are incredibly valid. I cannot imagine going through something the way that she did, but it almost felt like it was still too fresh. And she did publish this book about 8 years after the tsunami happened. And so I don't know everything there is to know about writing a book, but I do feel like writing a book takes a lot of time. 8 years, I would think, would not be a ton of time to process so many people you love dying. and how jarring and traumatizing that would be. And she obviously started writing the book well before the 8 years. And so it feels like she wrote it just to like process everything that happened, and it very much reads that way. And it reads as though she wrote it for herself, not for an audience, which is totally fine, just super, super not my speed. I think that if she had written about some of the other survivors and what they went through, maybe like a family that everyone survived miraculously, maybe talked about the environmental impacts or, you know, what we could be doing as society in order to be more prepared for these inevitable tsunamis. I don't know, but I just needed something a bit more. And I feel like the easy thing in a memoir is to write about, here, this horrible thing happened to me and here's how I got over it. And I'm not asking for that because I don't think that's realistic for what happened to her. But at the very least, I do feel like she could have done some ties to tsunamis, the environment, or like the other survivors in general, and it just would have given the book a lot more depth and made it more interesting. The next book was Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close by Jonathan... I'm so bad with the names. Jonathan Safran Foer. And this is a book about a young boy named Oscar whose dad dies in 9/11. And when his dad was alive, he would take him on these really cool scavenger hunts across the city. And basically, Oscar finds this key in his dad's closet and fully convinces himself that this key was supposed to be like a scavenger hunt from his dad. And so then the book is Oscar going on the scavenger hunt across New York City to try to figure out what this key goes into. And the book also has some flashbacks to Oscar's grandparents as well. I really struggled to get into this book. This was one that I physically read on paper. I can't remember how many books I physically read on paper. I have an e-reader now, and so a lot of these were e-reader reads. But this one was like a physical on paper. So I feel like I should have been able to get into it more so than a lot of other stuff that I read. But I feel like me struggling to get into it is a big reason why it's getting a 1 out of 5 from me. It jumped back and forth from Oscar to his grandfather's point of view quite a bit, and I found that to be kind of jarring, and I didn't really find either storyline super interesting. And because it was jumping back and forth, it was like, well, I wasn't really into that storyline, but like I'm also not into this one, and it just didn't give me enough time to get into any of them, although I'm not sure time would have helped that much. And I feel like this book actually had something in common with Lessons in Chemistry, where both of the main characters were quirky, and you're supposed to like how quirky they are, and I just couldn't get into it. I mean, Oscar is a child, but his main character trait is that he's really quirky and says really smart things for his age and things like that. And this is also a movie, and I have a feeling it comes across much better in a movie than it does in the book. I felt really bad for him, and I thought it was really sweet that he was going on this scavenger hunt, but I just wasn't connecting with him. This was also one of those books that does a bunch of funny things with the text where it runs in together and there's pictures and stuff like that, and that's just not my favorite, so not for me. The next book, which gets a 2 out of 5, so we have made our way out of the 1s and we're now in the 2s, is Eruption, which was essentially co-written by Michael Crichton and James Patterson. I'll explain more of that in a bit. But before I get into that, I want to say that I really, really enjoy reading Michael Crichton books. I have said before that I want to read every single one of them. The Jurassic Park series and Timeline are some of my favorite books ever. They're so good. But Michael Crichton definitely has some books that are not great. And for me, this one falls into that category. It wasn't that bad, but it was just so dramatic. The premise is that this huge eruption is going to happen on the big island of Hawaii. And if it happens, every single person on the island is going to pass away. So it's this big doomsday scenario, which I like reading about that kind of stuff, if you can't tell. But this particular volcano has a mysterious past, and there are some military secrets that can help. And so it's kind of a bit of a mystery. It's like a thriller, but there's some mysterious stuff sprinkled in that I was pretty interested in, and I found that aspect pretty intriguing. And I think part of the reason I didn't really love it was I listened to this one on audiobook, and the reader that reads it was like, the eruption is going to hit the big island of Hawaii. And that just made me laugh. Like, I was laughing at times because that's so ridiculous. And I don't know, it was just really hard for me to get into it. The way this book was written is kind of interesting though. So Michael Crichton wrote most of it, and then his wife found the manuscript and read all of it and got to the cliffhanger and was like, I need to know what happens at the end, basically. I think the way she worded it was that it was the first cliffhanger that wasn't supposed to be a cliffhanger, which is really sad. And she looked around for an author who would be able to finish it out for him and went with James Patterson. So I think that that is pretty interesting, and it got us another Michael Crichton book, which is pretty cool. And we're already up to the 3 out of 5 stars. I think I might be a high rater, or I don't know, I read some good books. I tend to not DNF books. Like if I start a book, I am finishing it. So it's actually kind of surprising that so many of these were so high this year. And I think of 3 out of 5 as I liked it. And that's pretty much it. And the first book in that category is The Distance Between Us by Reina Grande. This was one I also listened to on Spotify. And what's interesting about it is that I didn't have it on a list of books that I wanted to read. I was just scrolling through Spotify and it popped up and I was like, that looks interesting. So that's kind of a fun way to find a book, I think. Reina Grande is apparently an acclaimed author, and I don't say that to be mean. I just mean I literally didn't know who she was when I found the book on Spotify, and I didn't go into this book knowing anything about her. She was born in Mexico, and this book chronicles her childhood and early adolescence and what that experience was like with her being in Mexico when the majority of her family was in the United States, and then vice versa, when she ended up going to the United States and what it was like to go back and visit Mexico and having not great parents, to put it very nicely, and a really difficult upbringing. I felt like she did a really, really good job writing about her family members in an objective way. She definitely points out the things that she loves about her family members, but doesn't shy away about pointing out her family members' many, many flaws, like just super unabashedly talks about them, which I found really, really interesting to read. And I also felt like she captured the feeling and essence of childhood innocence quite well. In some ways, I kind of wish that I would have been able to get to know Reina Grande as an adult. The large majority of this book is about her childhood, and then it kind of gets into her adolescence, and then very quickly at the end, she sort of mentions some of her adulthood, and then it's done. And first off, I can't believe she has such vivid memories of her childhood. Like, I could not write such a book about my childhood. My childhood memories are just not that vivid. So that's kind of cool. But I also almost in some ways feel like there could be a sequel. I don't know anything about her as an author. How did that happen? She sort of sets that up at the end, like in her early 20s, but I just feel like I know so little about who she becomes, and I would have liked to. The next book, also 3 out of 5, is a collection of short stories by Stephen King called If It Bleeds. And I'm a big Stephen King fan. I read at least a couple a year. I've also said before that I want to read every Stephen King book, but there are so many. I don't know if I can commit to that, but I'm hoping to live to 96, so hopefully I have time. And I specifically and really only read this collection because the sequel to The Outsider, one of his other books, is one of the short stories, which is kind of weird. And before I get into the rest of it, I just really don't like that he did that. I'm not a big fan of short stories. I think some of it is that I just really like to read a book and really feel good about the fact that I read a book, and short stories just don't do it for me. Yeah, I read a collection of short stories, but I don't know. They're just not my favorite. So the order that this goes in is that it goes the Mr. Mercedes trilogy, which is one of my favorite sets of Stephen King books that I've read ever. They're so good. And then it's The Outsider. Then it's this short story that's in the middle of this collection of short stories. And then it's another true book. And so that's really weird to me that it's 4 real books, then a short story, and then another real book. Maybe you should have just taken the short story and put it in the beginning of the real book. And this was something that, I actually found out about this because my mom skipped the short story and just jumped into the next book, which is called Holly, and was super confused about what was going on. And then later found out that there's a short story and then was just disgusted and never went back to read it. And so I at least knew because of her mistake that this existed, but I'm sure my mom's not the only person that made this mistake. But anyway, none of this is about the book itself, so let's get into that. So there were 4 short stories total. One is the sequel to The Outsider. One is one of the creepiest things I've ever read. It's about a talking rat. One is called The Life of Chuck, and then there was another one that's about a phone. The talking rat one is the one that has really stuck with me, and really the only one that I remember super clearly. And it's kind of funny because I've read a lot of Stephen King. I don't know. I mean, he's written a lot of books, but I've read some of his what's deemed to be as like pretty creepy stuff. Like I've read Pet Sematary, The Shining, It, and the two creepiest books I've ever read by him that really got me were The Outsider and this short story about a rat. I don't know what it was, but if you like creepy, in my opinion, it just really creeped me out. I'll never read it again. I didn't like it. I mean, like, it got to me, which I guess is kind of the point. But, I don't know. I found the short story about a phone to be pretty intriguing. The premise was about being able to call someone in the afterlife because these are short stories, I feel like I can't give any information about them really without giving stuff away, so that's all I'm gonna say. But I thought it was really intriguing, and it was also pretty creepy, but in a manageable way, like most Stephen King books usually are to me. If you're a short story person, I would recommend reading that one. I enjoyed it. If It Bleeds was the Outsider sequel, and when I was taking notes for this video, I went back and read a synopsis of it, and none of it stuck with me. Truly none of it. And I know that some of it did matter for the next book, which I also read last year and I will get into. So like I definitely remembered it at the time, but yeah, I totally didn't stick with me at all. The last book was The Life of Chuck, and that one also didn't stick with me. I remember feeling intrigued, like a little interested when I was reading it, but that's about it. I mean, short stories just aren't for me. 3 out of 5. And the next book is super easy to talk about because it's Holly by Stephen King. It's that next one that I talked about. And like I mentioned, Holly originally appears in that Mr. Mercedes trilogy, which I loved. She's a character that I just wanted to see do anything. Like I just really, really like her. And so it was nice to be able to read her book. And I really can't talk about this book much because it's so far into this series. Anything I say would be a spoiler, but I really enjoyed the premise of this book. I found it super intriguing. It was like nothing I've ever read about. I couldn't put it down. I was pretty interested in seeing what was going to happen. And I found the main plot point just really disgusting, interesting, weird, horrifically awful. If you've read this book, obviously horrifically awful, but just I've never read about that before. And so it was like, I can't peeking at the book with one eye, like, oh, that's awful. But I'm so interested. So you might think, wow, Sloan, you're saying a lot of positive stuff about this book. Why is it here on the list? And it's because this book was just so political, and especially about the pandemic. And it's too soon. It's too soon for me. And I know I'm not the only one. The pandemic was not that long ago. It was kind of traumatizing. I do not need to read about it. I need to wait a while. It's too soon to be writing about it. I don't know. And it was just such a huge point of the book that I had to just close my eyes and read past, and it was hard. Stephen King definitely took this as his opportunity to speak about the pandemic, which is absolutely his right as an author. And it's just not why I pick up fiction in a lot of ways. I do think that fiction can speak better than nonfiction in some senses. Like maybe in 10 years, I will get a lot out of a book about the pandemic. But honestly, I don't even know if 10 years would be long enough. It's just too soon. I feel like I had a lot of 3 out of 5s this year, and the next one was also a 3 out of 5. It was Killers of the Flower Moon by David Grann. I read 2 David Grann books this year, and this one is ranked lower than the other one, but I think part of the reason for that is that I watched the movie first, which is like a 3-hour-long Leonardo DiCaprio movie, and I watched the movie because my husband just really wanted to go see it really badly. He loves the movie theaters where you can sit and they bring you, it's basically like a restaurant where you can order off of a real menu and they bring you food. And I also really like those. And I don't know, like the premise of the movie seemed interesting, so I went and saw it. But that is incredibly rare for me. I honestly can't name another time. Ooh, I can actually. I did this, like this is so rare for me. I watched Bridgerton without reading the book. And this with Killers of the Flower Moon. I watched the movie before reading the book, which I immediately regretted because the movie was amazing. It was so good that I was like, I have to read the book. And I think I just read the book too soon after watching the movie. I probably should have waited a couple years or maybe longer to kind of like forget some things, because the book was also very good, but it was like just as good as the movie to me. I haven't even talked about the premise of this. It is a historical true crime book about the Osage Nation in the 1920s. And the Osage were some of the richest people in the world at that time because oil was discovered on their land. And this was the extreme oil craze of the 1920s. But with extreme wealth comes extreme danger. That was goofy. And a lot of people were murdered in order to steal money. And I didn't know anything about this. The process of how the money moved around was super interesting and like extremely sad that this was all real. And this book was historical true crime, but also very much a mystery, trying to unravel who did the killings, who's responsible. And it was also extremely dangerous to investigate this. Very, very dangerous for the detectives that were doing it. And so there was just like a lot of suspense on, you know, is this person going to be okay? And so with that being said, watching the movie first means that I knew what happens. I knew like kind of the mysterious part. And so I think that took away a lot of the fun of the book. And so if you're interested in this, if you're watching this, you're a book person, definitely read the book first, then go watch the movie. They're both great. If you're a movie person and you don't read, I don't know why you'd be watching this, but yeah, sure, go watch the movie. But I wish I would have read the book first. David Grann did go in depth at the end about his investigative journalism process. And I did really enjoy reading about that, kind of like the behind the scenes of who he interviewed. And that gave it a really good ending too that wasn't in the movie at all. And so I did really enjoy that kind of extra piece. But this is sitting at 3 out of 5. I think if I hadn't watched the movie first, it probably would have been a 4 out of 5, maybe even a 5 out of 5. And I definitely really like David Grann. Will for sure be reading more of his stuff. Now we're into the 4 stars, and this is Madhouse at the End of the Earth, subtitled The Belgica's Journey into the Dark Antarctic Night. And it's by Julian Sancton. This is another nonfiction book, and this one is about a group of explorers who go to explore Antarctica, uncharted waters there. This was like peak exploring the world time, and we didn't really know a lot about Antarctica at the time. And so they go there to explore, but their boat ends up getting frozen in on the ice and they're stuck there. This book is right up my alley in terms of the types of books I really like, and I did really, really enjoy it. Clearly, I like natural disasters and explorers quite a bit. The authors set the premise up really well, and even though you know what's going to happen, there's so much suspense because there's a lot of back and forth on should we turn around or should we stay? And you know they're going to get frozen, but you just don't know if it's right now. Like you don't know if there's going to be a mutiny. Like you just have no idea, and it's so interesting. I read a lot about explorers, but this was the first book I've read on polar exploration specifically, and I thought that was really interesting, the race to explore it. And it was so dangerous at the time. I think I would love to read more about polar exploration specifically. Sancton also wrote a lot about journaling for explorers, and he did talk about other groups of explorers as well to kind of fill up the background of what was happening. And I found what he shared about journaling to be super interesting. Like there was one example where I don't remember who the explorer was, but they were journaling up until the brink of death. Like they knew they were going to die, but they had to be writing about their experiences and what they were seeing and their feelings and things like that. And that was the kind of culture at the time with explorers, was like journaling was one of the most important things that you could do. And first off, as a journaler, I think that's so fun, but also like, why aren't men doing that now? Like, I feel like the modern day man should be journaling like explorers were. And how'd we go wrong? Where did we go astray? The next book was a fiction book by Matt Haig called The Midnight Library. And this was a book that I read on my e-reader. This book is about a woman named Nora Seed, who is incredibly regretful, miserable, sad, you name it. And after some certain things happen, she ends up in a library where every single book in the library is her life if she had made one or more different decisions. It's a book about the butterfly effect in a lot of ways, where if I had made this decision, what would have gone differently? And it has a very strong moral lesson that's kind of the point. You could probably guess it just based off what I'm saying. I'm trying not to share too much. But I actually watched a video similar to this, actually the exact same premise as this. It was the inspiration for this video, so I'll link it down below. And she read The Midnight Library as well. And she said something like, if you read this book and it speaks to you, you were going through something. And I definitely think that that's true. There really weren't a ton of surprises in this book, but I really enjoyed seeing Nora process all of the things she was seeing as she looked through the books. And it was nice seeing her grow and learn. And in the end, reading the book made me feel a little bit better about life generally, which sometimes is just exactly what you need when reading a book. When I took my notes for this, I was like, I'll definitely be reading more Matt Haig. And actually, I'm reading a Matt Haig book right now in January. I'm now reading Humans by him, so hopefully it's good. Okay, so we still actually have an entire trilogy that we haven't gotten to. And so I'll start out with the very first book that I'll mention, which is A Gathering of Shadows by V.E. Schwab. V.E. Schwab is a pen name for a woman. I know her first name is Victoria. I can't remember what the E stands for, but she wrote The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, which was the first book that I read by her and is, I think, a bit more popular than the series. But I loved The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue when I read that, and this was a series that my husband had read and really recommended, and so I was like, well, I loved that book. I'll read this one. A Gathering of Shadows is the second book in the trilogy, which the whole trilogy is called Shades of Magic. And going in order of rating is kind of weird when I'm talking about a trilogy and I'm like, here's the second one. So I'm not going to share too much. This particular book had kind of an Olympic Games like fight to see who's the best kind of vibes, which was definitely entertaining. And I did enjoy it, but it was my least favorite of the three. The next book is actually the third book in the trilogy, which is A Conjuring of Light. I also really enjoyed this one. I felt like it tied up the series nicely. I also just really love the characters in the series, and so it was nice seeing the growth that they had and just like frankly seeing what happened to them at the end I was very curious to see what was going to happen. And I did really enjoy it, but I didn't like it as much as the first book, which is why I haven't told you about the first book yet, and we'll get to it eventually. Continuing with the 4 out of 5s, we are now at The Crook Factory by Dan Simmons, and this was the most recent book that I read. I actually finished it on December 31st. I didn't think it was going to make it in this video, but we squeaked right by. And what was interesting about this book is that a lot of it is about the FBI, or that's like a huge part of it. And The Killers of the Flower Moon talked a lot about specific people within the FBI, and The Crook Factory took place like very soon after The Killers of the Flower Moon. So a lot of the like characters, for lack of a better way of putting it, even though they're real people, were the same. And so that was super fun. Like The Crook Factory almost reads like a sequel to Killers of the Flower Moon, just based on the time period, and that it's also FBI related, because The Killers of the Flower Moon that's when the FBI was created, which is really interesting. And so then The Crook Factory, it's like, okay, the FBI is still like pretty new. Hoover was the person that was running it at the time, and he was the first person to run the FBI. And so I don't know, I liked that I read them in the same year for that reason. But what's also interesting about The Crook Factory is that it's technically fiction, but according to the author, it's 95% true. And sometimes as I was reading it, I would have to Google things and be like, is that real? And it always was. So I don't know, like, obviously take it with a grain of salt. It is fiction, but like super, super cool that so much of it was real. It is about Ernest Hemingway's Crook Factory, which was a counter-espionage spy ring that he set up in Cuba during World War II. And basically, the premise is that the main character, Joe, who is FBI, is sent to go monitor Ernest Hemingway and doesn't really know why he's there to monitor him, like thinks it's this really weird assignment. And Joe is fictional. He's not real. But a bunch of super crazy things that at least a lot of it is real. Like the fact that Hemingway set up a counter-espionage spy ring in Cuba, what? Like that's crazy. And that's 100% real. He absolutely did that. Every character in this book is super layered, very compelling. Even like the super very, very side characters were always very interesting. And a lot of them were stars that, you know, were big at the time. So like Gary Cooper is in it. Ian Fleming is in it for a brief period of time. And I don't know that Ian Fleming actually ever stepped foot on Cuban soil. So like that's an area where I'm like, I don't know if that was real, but Hemingway was very plugged into celebrities and actors and stuff like that. And so in some ways, maybe it was easier for Dan Simmons to have such compelling characters because they were real public figures that he could go out and research. But regardless, it was super interesting. Ernest Hemingway's relationship with his wife at the time, I think this is like his third or fourth wife, Martha Gellhorn, was really interesting to read about. And she was an author herself. And I have to say, reading this book made me super interested in reading another Hemingway book. I haven't read one in years. And I've read some that I've enjoyed. I really liked A Farewell to Arms when I was in high school, didn't like The Old Man and the Sea, and I'm not sure if I've read a Hemingway since high school. And so in 2025, I definitely want to read a few more classics and definitely will throw a Hemingway in there after reading this book. I feel like reading The Crook Factory, I almost think I know Hemingway. Like that's how I walked away from the book. Obviously, I don't know Hemingway, but his character was written so well that I really feel like I'm going to read a Hemingway novel very differently than I read them before. Just knowing Hemingway's personality a bit more, which I think was fairly accurate. He was a huge alcoholic, which was kind of insane to read, but also hilarious in a lot of ways. Like he made some bad decisions. So I'll be looking forward to that in 2025. And I really loved The Crook Factory. I couldn't put it down, and yet it took me a month to finish it, so it wasn't an easy read. There are a lot of FBI and World War II acronyms, as well as all the other countries' versions of FBI, all of their acronyms, and I really struggled to keep them straight. So that's going to take some time to wade through if you're not overly familiar with like World War II FBI type things. I'll definitely be more prepared for the next FBI World War II book that I read, which I enjoyed this, so there might be another. Overall, I've already highly recommended this book to other people, including my dad. I'm really trying to get my dad to read it. I don't know why, I just felt like he would really like it. And so I would definitely recommend this book. And I will for sure be reading more Dan Simmons in the future. I think his most well-known book is called The Terror. And so maybe that'll be on my list for 2025. The next book is another 4 out of 5, which is Hail Mary by Andy Weir. I didn't look up how to pronounce anything before I filmed this. That's not the point, okay? But I read this book on the beach in Punta Cana on my bachelorette, and it was a great book to read on the beach. The premise of this book is that the main character, Ryland, wakes up and he's in the middle of space. He can't remember anything, not even his own name, but he knows that he's been asleep for a very long time. He's millions and millions of miles away from home, and something is very wrong. I think a lot of the fun in this book come from the surprises of what happens next, so I'm not going to share anything else, but it's thrilling, mysterious, and also very heartfelt, and I just couldn't put it down, so it was the perfect beach read. It's been a long time since I've read The Martian, which is also by Andy Weir, and I also really loved The Martian, but I think I loved Hail Mary even more. It was just so heartfelt, which isn't something I remember feeling about The Martian, and something I really, really enjoyed. I could see myself rereading this one for sure. And we are into our 5-star reads, of which I had 3 this year, and before I get into it, I'll share that a 5-star read to me is more of a feeling than anything else. Like it's truly just, I read it and I just think, wow, I loved that book. And that's kind of it. So I think that's the only reason that Hail Mary and The Crook Factory didn't make it into the 5 stars, was that I just didn't have a, wow, that was just so amazing. I'm so glad I spent my time doing that feeling, even though I really, really, really enjoyed them. Let me know how you decide what your 5-star read is. I know a lot of people think of a 5-star read as like, I would reread this. And there's a lot of books that I read in 2024 that I would happily reread in the future. So it's not that. It's just a feeling. It's just a feeling. The first 5-star read is The Lost City of Z by David Grann. And I actually read this before I read Killers of the Flower Moon and just freaking loved it. It was so inspirational to me. Before reading this book, if you asked me, hey Sloan, what would you do if you won the lottery? I don't know what I would say. I'd probably be like, I'd have a huge garden and I don't know. But after reading this book, I know that my answer would be that I would find some explorer to go read about and travel around the world, going to all the places that they explored and reading all of their journals and writing a really cool book about this explorer. And that's what this book is. It's about the explorer Percy Fawcett, who disappeared while he was looking for the lost city of Z, which is essentially El Dorado in the Amazon. David Grann writes about the theories that would prove its existence versus its non-existence, and about the obsession that other people had with Fawcett at the time and how he kind of gained a following of people who truly thought that he was correct and that this existed, and just the obsession with El Dorado, the lost city of Z in general. Many people died going after him too. A lot of people died in the Amazon trying to find the lost city of Z, and then like more people died just looking for Fawcett. It was super interesting, and I think just a good book to read about that reminds you of people's conviction when they believe something. So many people truly, truly, truly believed in Fawcett. And even after he disappeared, they were like, well, he disappeared because he found it. And I don't know, just interesting. Fawcett also believed in the city so strongly that when he disappeared with his son and his son's best friend. Like, that's who he was exploring with. So, I mean, we don't know what happened to him. Presumably he died. And if he did, he died with his son, which is just like, he believed in this so much that he risked his own son, which is so interesting to me. Also interesting that he just inadvertently caused so many deaths after him. This book was super compelling, very inspirational to me, like I said, and just right up my alley. It was great. 5 out of 5. I'm just gonna make my way through a ton of David Grann books now, which is part of the reason why I've read Killers of the Flower Moon as well last year. And I'm just hoping that I win the lottery someday so that I have the time and money to be able to do essentially what David Grann does. It's so cool to me. The next book is nothing new to anyone, probably. It's Gone Girl by Gillian Flynn. This book was so good. This is the second best book that I read in 2024. When I say I couldn't put it down, I had this thing glued to my face. The premise is that Nick and Amy are a married couple that are living in New York City, but they end up having to move to Nick's hometown where they buy a typical suburban home. Every year, Amy does a huge elaborate scavenger hunt for their wedding anniversary. And on the morning of their 5th wedding anniversary, Nick wakes up and Amy has disappeared. This book is very much a crime, thriller, mystery, and you're going to spend a good chunk of it wondering what happened to Amy, so it's super suspenseful. It also featured unreliable narration, which I actually normally really don't like, but I did really enjoy it in this book. And I think this is a great book to go into knowing as little as possible. That's what I did when I read it. I knew nothing about it other than this is a good book, and I super enjoyed it. So I'm not going to share anything else. This is also a time to share that for a number of these books, I knew nothing about them going in. I have a habit of not reading the dust jacket of a book. If it's something that someone recommended, I just go into it completely blind and just read it and like hope for the best. And sometimes that really bites me in the butt. Like, there are some books that you really do need to kind of know what's going to happen before reading it. So I've been trying to actually read the dust jacket more, but this was one, you don't need to read the dust jacket. Just know it's fantastic. Know it's a great fiction book. You're not going to be able to put it down, and I really recommend it. And we have arrived at the very last book, the best book that I read in 2024. You might know what it is. It is the first book in the Shades of Magic series by V.E. Schwab, A Darker Shade of Magic. And now I can talk more about what these books are about. So essentially, it's a fantasy book about a world in which there are 4 different Londons. A white London, a gray London, a red London. What's the 4? A black London. Can't forget about the black London. The black one has actually been sealed away. Why? You're just going to have to read and find out. The main character, Kel, is a magician called an Antari, and he's one of the only people who can travel between the worlds. He's a resident of the Red London, but travels to Gray and White London often to be able to pass information to the different leaders of those worlds. And Gray London is the London we know and love. I've never been to London, but it's like actual London. It's not fantasy London. So that's kind of fun to see, like, a magician, these fantastical elements in the real world. While Kel is in Grey London, and shortly after, he participates in one of his favorite hobbies, which is smuggling items between the worlds, which is like extremely frowned upon. He runs into Delilah Bard, who ends up stealing an item from him. This book has so much adventure, so much action, and what I loved about it is that it just sucked me in so completely. Ever since I read Harry Potter as a kid, I've just always searching for that feeling of feeling like I'm in a world, and that's exactly what this book did for me. The world building was just so good, and Kel and Delilah are delightful. I really, really cared about them. Kel is special in that he's an Antari, but he also had a really complicated childhood. It's kind of special a la Harry Potter in some ways. Like, I feel like it's really common in fantasy books that you read something and the main character is special. Delilah is super tough, extremely messy, and insists she doesn't care about anyone, so she has a lot to work through there. Most of the series in general is both of them processing their past and trying to figure out what they really want to have for the future, which is also just a really interesting layer to have on this already cool, fantastical world that I'm sucked into. And together they get into a lot of trouble that's really fun to read about. This book is super fast paced, it's sensational, and it will get you out of a reading slump in a heartbeat. I really, really, really enjoyed it. It's the best book of 2024 because nothing sucked me in and left such an impression as this book did. I just loved it. It gave me that feeling that I mentioned earlier. And that is it. Those are all 17 books I read in 2024, ranked from the worst of the worst, lessons in chemistry, to the best of the best, a darker shade of magic. Thanks so much for watching this video. I had a lot of fun making it. It was kind of a fun deviation from my usual content, but I love to read. I think I'll probably make another one of these next year just for funsies. It's also a good challenge for me to actually sit there and put into words why I didn't like or like a book, which usually I just give a rating on Goodreads and move on. So it's a good little mental exercise for me. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!